For this next session of the Future of the American Child Journalism Training in Charlotte, we're going to be pivoting to the issue of juvenile justice. Ironically, there is a link to some of the earlier discussions we've had today because so many of the young people in America's foster care system have cascading series of challenges and systemic issues that their families are facing that ultimately mean they wind up in the juvenile justice system. And as I think about what journalists need to grasp about this issue and how they need to be creative in reporting about it, I feel our next speaker is somebody who's going to be invaluable to us in terms of giving us that context and inspiring us to sort of level up when it comes to reporting on juvenile justice. Meribah Knight is a reporter with Nashville Public Radio. And as I was doing the preparation for this training, I came across her podcast series, The Kids of Rutherford County. And as a former NPR, I should say reporter, I know the work that it takes to put together not only the technical aspects of good radio, but also the relationship building and the reporting that you need to do to make sure that you're including the right voices and that you're giving them the room to say what they need to say. So Meribah, thank you so much for joining us for the training.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I want to meet everybody. I'm just so excited to be around other journalists. We are a tribe for sure. And also to hear from all these amazing, people deep in the system and in the work. It's so important. And yeah, it's funny because children have been kind of a through line for a lot of my work, even from a cub reporter. I tend to gravitate towards kids, whether it's in education or kids experiencing homelessness or the system, juvenile justice system, all that stuff. It's I just keep kind of going with those themes. So my presentation is about kind of how the story evolved and came to be. I feel so lucky to come after all these amazing folks who've talked about the system because I obviously, as journalists, we're kind of dilettantes. We try to learn as much as we can, and then we try to take that and tell a story. And I think with these kinds of stories, it's so important to be able to tell a compelling story because these are really difficult topics. They're really hard stories to hear, and you want to keep people listening. You want to kind of give them the vegetables, along with the stuff that is going to taste good. And part of that is the story, kind of how you craft the story. So a little bit about me. I've always loved narrative. I've always loved stories. My mom is a children's book writer. My dad was a documentary filmmaker. So you combine those two and you get a radio reporter. But I started out not knowing at all that I wanted to be a journalist. I went to NYU. I majored in racial politics and African American studies. And I was just fascinated by culture, and I just was I think every reporter is just really curious, right? You're just I want to know everything about everything. But I didn't think that it was journalism that I would go into. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to work in magazines, so I tried to make it in New York for a little bit and could not stand that. I was literally like Anne Hathaway in Devil Wears Prada, to the point where she goes to Northwestern journalism school. It's that was me. That's what I did. So when I was in my mid-20s, I went to Northwestern J School and came out of that just completely in love with the profession of journalism and the act of finding stories, and a really strong respect for the process and the skill set of reporting, and then also with this just total love and passion for storytelling. So that's kind of where I think my identity as a professional is combining the rigors of reporting with the really high level rigors of storytelling. What is a good story? How do you frame a story? Who's going to drive the story? Kind of all of these elements that you find in fiction, that you find in good film, that I love all of that. And so when I got into J school, it was like 2008, and the bottom had fallen out of everything. So like I couldn't get a job. I was gonna get a job at like a suburban paper in Chicago and do the thing where like it's the feeder paper to the Tribune, and then you get to the Tribune, and then and they had a hiring freeze, so that was not gonna be possible. So I had to like start freelancing right away, which meant I had to like think about really good stories and like pitch them to editors like kind of fully formed, and that was really great. And after I did that for about 10 months. I was able to start working with a fledgling experiment that the New York Times was doing, which was setting up these hyper-local bureaus. They did one in Chicago, which was the Chicago News Cooperative, and they had one in the Bay Area, and they had one in Austin, Texas, which is the Texas Tribune now. And that was so wonderful, like working and getting edited by the New York Times, like having your stories in the New York Times, like print edition for the Midwest and online. I mean, I grew up reading the Times. This was like a real moment. It was great. That lasted about 2.5 years because guess what? They hadn't solved the problem of making money into sustainable journalism. So I lost my job. And then I went and I did something very scary for me, which was become a business reporter, which I never thought I would be. But I went to Crane's Chicago Business. And I actually, I learned so much because everything is about money. Like, follow the money. You just got to follow the money. So it pushed me to learn how to follow the money and to learn about kind of how, a city is a business. So how do businesses run? And then from there, I decided I want to do radio. Like, this was a moment in time where I felt like radio was the exciting place for storytelling. As much as I wanted to be like a New Yorker writer, like that was just not like realistic. Like those jobs aren't just happening. But it felt like audio, podcasting, that was a really exciting place to be, and also a very natural place for me because I want to get very close to a story. I'm very narrative driven, and the idea that I don't have to write the voice, that the voice can come through and it can be so centered in the person and in the place. I just got very interested in that. And the moment I started fiddling with it, I was doing some stuff for WBEZ in Chicago, I just completely fell in love. My husband is a photojournalist. He got laid off when the Chicago Sun-Times laid off their entire photography department. He was a casualty of that. So having two journalists in a household is a little difficult to find jobs. So he found a job at the Tennessean, and we moved to Nashville. And that was the beginning of, and then I got a job at the NPR affiliate and promptly dove into covering housing issues. And I started my first podcast doing a year-long piece on the largest public housing complex in the city that was about to go through this huge transformation to mixed income. So I have a bit of a weird, I've kind of hopped around, but the thing that has been a through line is that I just try to seek out really immersive narrative stories where oftentimes they are marginalized communities, marginalized folks who I really try to center in the story and build a kind of story around empathy and build a story that will allow you to lean into the complexities of the human experience and of the folks that we don't pay enough attention to, but also kind of jolt you awake and keep you there with the story. So keep you there. So that's kind of my trajectory. So.
I think I speak for everyone in the room when I say I hope you're taking applications for new friends.
Oh, I am always taking applications for new friends, and I love talking about stories.
We would kind of love to hang out.
Yes. Well, I'm here till tomorrow.
So before I go back to my seat, I wonder if you would just tell us about the genesis of this particular project and how you got started with the Kids of Rutherford County.
Yeah, and so I don't want to I don't want to Bigfoot on my presentation, because I'll go into more detail. But essentially, it started out the month after I moved to Nashville. I was sitting there trying to read every single paper, trying to understand the new city I was living in, and there was this story that was all over the place about a bunch of kids that had been arrested for not stopping a fight. And I thought, what the hell? Coming from Chicago, I had covered a lot of child welfare issues. I covered DCFS, I covered housing, I covered, gun violence. I had seen a fair amount, and I had never seen this. And so I just really couldn't understand what was happening. And it was the beginning of like a 6-year odyssey of like trying to understand why. So I'll go into it in my presentation. But
that's a perfect way to get us into that.
Okay,
so take
great.
it away.
Okay, awesome. I had been in Nashville a month, and then suddenly this story, oh yeah, okay, this is my podcast. Hello. So this is what ended up like years later. It's called the Kids of Rutherford County. I can talk a little bit more about, at the end in questions, like kind of what I do now, which is partnerships. I think that this is a huge place of potential for long-form investigative, like high-impact journalism, because as we all know, it's not easy for journalism right now. It hasn't been for a while. And part of what, and also, I am a local reporter. I live in the community where I report. I want to do stories that impact that community, but I also want to do stories that a national audience can listen to and can resonate with them. So my goal really is to say I'm a local journalist, but I want to create a pipeline to the nation with my work. And so how do I do that? How do I partner with places going to allow me to get this story out? And the latest one was Serial Productions and the New York Times. And it was the Kids of Rutherford County. Okay, so when I got to Nashville, I'd been there a month, and suddenly it's like, these are the headlines. And I'm like, what is going on? I mean, you see the New York Times is there, Washington Post, these are the local papers, like it had gone everywhere because there was this video of these kids in this kind of scuffle, these like really young kids, and suddenly like they were all arrested. And it was all over the place. Like some people were saying 6-year-olds, like nobody had the quite numbers of how many there were. Maybe there were 10, maybe there were 9, 11. At any rate, it was a big story. It was going everywhere. And I was like, what is going on? And we all know that like the first thing we do with a story is we ask a question. Every single investigation, every story, to me, it boils down to what is the question that you are asking. And in this instance, the question I was asking was, why are children being arrested for such minor offenses in this county? What is happening? And I think it's really important when you start an investigation to really identify, like, what is that question? That is your North Star. You know, investigations can get sprawling, they can go all over the place, but when you have something that you can come back to and say, I am trying to answer this very basic question, like, it's a real touchstone for me, and I think for every reporter. Okay, then I got to the point where I was like, well, how do you answer this question? And it's really difficult because juvenile court is private, the records are sealed. Most of the court proceedings are not open to the public. In Tennessee, our juvenile court system merges dependency and neglect and delinquency. So the same judge is hearing dependency and neglect cases, and they're hearing delinquency cases, essentially, which is like kids accused of breaking the law, or status offenses, kids accused of doing things that are not technically crimes, but they're crimes for kids, like running away, smoking, drinking underage, not going to school. So just, you know, I mean, the title, I think, of this was like, why is our system so broken? From a reporting standpoint, one of the reasons I see is because we can't get inside of it. We can't tell stories that really humanize and get into the problems because we can't get inside. It's like a black box. And so that's a huge challenge for a reporter. And you know, it makes sense, right? Like, we don't want to just be able to look inside of kids' files. But as the story, you know, progressed, like what I saw was that a lot of times that wasn't protecting the kids, I was protecting the adults that were making decisions for them. The adults in charge who had their own ideas about how to discipline a child or what a child needs in their life or whether their parents were fit or unfit. And so that's a really unfortunate and scary place to be as a reporter when you're trying to get inside, but there are ways around it. And that's what I want to talk about next. Suddenly, more things started popping up in the newspaper. there was all these lawsuits, which is the natural next step after your child gets arrested at 7 or 8 years old, is that you sue the people that arrested them. Because what it turned out is that they had messed up royally, and that the crime that they had said these kids committed was criminal responsibility for conduct of another, which essentially what they were saying was you didn't step in to stop this fight, so you are guilty of this fight. It turned out to not even be a real charge. So they had a few problems. I go into that in my story that I did with ProPublica, but there's some real gaps in the system of legal knowledge around charges and because criminal responsibility is actually a legal theory, and what they should have, if they were going to try to charge them with something, it would have been assault, by criminal responsibility. So they messed up bad. All of the kids their families start suing. And for a reporter, this is really helpful, because what it does is it puts documents, it puts stuff into the court record, right? So suddenly what was a black box is less so. You can get into it through all the filings, discovery, all this stuff. So when I started to see that there was all these lawsuits, I found that there were 7 lawsuits. And I started looking. I started looking into who were the lawyers on these lawsuits, who were these lawsuits against. And I noticed that they were all the same, 5 of the 7 lawsuits were the same 3 lawyers. So that tells me, I gotta go talk to them. But also that these lawsuits were sometimes against the arresting officer. And this is kind of the confusing part about looking for lawsuits in PACER, which is the federal court system website. Sometimes there's all different defendants. This one has tons of defendants. All the officers that arrested them, the city, then the county. And so it can be a bit of a mess, a kind of a spaghetti soup trying to find the lawsuits, but you got to, PACER is kind of something that you got to keep working with, and eventually you'll find what you need. And I started to read complaints, right? So think about it. I see this event, I get this question, I start to think, how the heck do I figure out what this is? Oh, there's lawsuits. Oh, I can go into those. I can read those lawsuits, and I can read the complaints. And here's one of the first complaints. In it, I see there's a judge who maintains some weird policy that's telling the police, a judge telling the police that they've gotta arrest kids. And then once they get arrested, then they go to the jail and wait, they're being illegally jailed? And now they're gonna do a class action lawsuit? So for me, this is what was their question? Why are children being arrested for such minor offenses? What I see in the complaint is that there's some weird policy allegedly put into place by the judge, and then there's some other weird policy put in place at the jail, which the judge also oversees, that's holding kids. This is strange and weird, and obviously very intriguing to a journalist. So I keep digging. And oops, wait, hold on. Oh yeah, I was gonna go back and say see, these are the things. Okay, and then I think about back to my question. So I've kind of answered the question, but if I put a story out, what is still happening, right? So obviously there's information out there about this policy, but I also see that despite these 7 lawsuits surrounding this juvenile court system, the judge is still the judge, the jailer is still the jailer, and this is where the accountability reporting comes in, right? This is where, as a journalist, you think, not only do I have a very troubling thing, a question that I'm trying to answer, and I think I have the answer, and I think it's really problematic, the people that are in charge of this system, the people that put these policies into place, are still in their jobs. So for a reporter, you're okay, something needs to be done so that we can hold these people accountable, the adults doing this. So that's my gift. So then I'm okay, so what do I do next? I gotta find everything I can get my hands on. I gotta find documents, records, evidence, sources, anything that I can get my hands on, and that's gonna come in all forms, right? First step I go to is PACER. Does anybody play with PACER, use PACER? Great, okay. So this is the class action lawsuit. There are hundreds of filings in here, but I just did talking about kind of the black box and how to get inside the black box. just doing a search for exhibits, this is gold, okay? So what I find is there's an exhibit of, these are all, let me just tell you, these are all things that we could never get our hands on. We can't ask the court or the jail for their arrest records. Those are all sealed. But the lawyers, they can get those in discovery, and then they can enter them into evidence. And so what they've done is they've entered in a spreadsheet of all these kids that are arrested. They're saying that were illegally arrested. All these kids that were illegally jailed. They've got more spreadsheets, and then they've got depositions of jail staff, depositions by the judge, depositions by the jailer, and then they've got letter, memo, training materials. They have the whole apparatus. Like they're entering it into evidence so that a reporter like me can come along and pull it and start to piece together that this arrest that happened in 2016 was the tip of the iceberg. What is underneath that arrest is a whole system run by a judge and the jailer she appointed, and the policies that they have created that go totally amok of the law. And nobody's been watching them. And the county's just letting them do it. These memos are so interesting. I didn't put them up here, but it's essentially the memo saying, officers arrest every single child accused of any crime, even a status offense. Arrest them and take them to the jail for processing. And once they got to the jail, the other policy was, do we think you are a true threat? There was no definition for what that meant. And if someone felt that they were a true threat, they were going to hold them. There was a whole statute on when to arrest kids and when to jail kids. They didn't care about that statute. They had made up their own rules. And it was all being laid out in these lawsuits, especially in this class action that was brought by those 3 lawyers who had kind of picked off these smaller lawsuits from the kids that had been arrested and started to amass this much bigger one. Then, talking about more evidence, then what came out after the arrest, about 10 months after the arrest of those kids, was an external, the police department decided to investigate itself. Police departments love to investigate themselves and say they've done nothing wrong. But this is like a 144-page investigative file. It was actually pretty good because they had a new police chief at that point who had just been there 2 weeks when the arrest happened. He had come from Oregon. He was like, what did I get myself into? And so he, out of full transparency, asked the Nashville police to come in and do a parallel investigation. And so there was that report too, which was much more thorough. But what I noticed on the second page was that they said all of these, all of what you're going to read and kind of these digests of accounts was Officer Mark Todd's audio recorded interviews of the following people. And I was like, oh, I need all of those. So I sent in a public records request. And I asked for all of the audio. It turned out to be 38 hours of audio, and it is what the entire first episode of the podcast is built off of. There's only one original interview in that first episode. All the rest of it is audio from that I got through a public records request. And it was so valuable because you found out what everybody was thinking when this was happening. And I want to play one clip of Crystal Templeton, who is the officer who saw the video and decided to arrest all these kids. And she, in her own words, is saying, why did she do this? So can you play that clip?
There's an assault.
Oh, can you
here.
turn it up a little bit?
There's a victim
Sorry.
here.
Yeah.
Juvenile court is about rehabilitation.
Yeah, thanks.
There's an assault here. There's a victim here. Juvenile court is about rehabilitation. And I felt like I needed to do something to help these kids. If I can get them in front of the judge, maybe she can put some services in the home, parenting, I don't know, whatever. It's about rehabilitation.
Did anybody at any point, any supervisor, did any of them at any point tell you, no, you're not going to do this?
No. No one ever said no. No one ever said, leave it alone. No one ever said to me that. They knew why I was doing what I was doing. So, and if somebody told me no, stop, I would have stopped.
That to me was like so critical to hear that, because we've been talking about like systems all day. And to me, that felt like that was the system. The system was arrest kids, take them to the judge, and let the judge do with them what they will. Don't ask questions. And here you had a system that was built on an illegal policy of officers arresting kids that would go before a judge who initiated that illegal policy, who then would send them to her jail that had another illegal policy. Like, these are the steps. And she's a cog in that wheel. She's been trained. See kids doing things wrong. Get them to the judge. The judge will help them. Not realizing that the judge will actually subject them to illegal policies. So to me, like, I could never get these interviews, right? And I think as a journalist, like, sometimes we look at these long reports and we think, wow, there's a lot of stuff in there. And there is. But really looking at what is the underlying material, what is that report based on, and can I get that stuff? Like, that's the step further that you want to go, and that's what really, like, when I got this audio, and granted, like, it cost about $800 to get all this audio. And the reason why it cost that much is because they had to listen to all of it and redact all the kids' names, because it's private, right? Kids' information is private. So, but even with that, I didn't need the kids' names. But I was like, okay, you gotta do what you gotta do. But granted, like, it took a little while because they literally had to listen to all 38 hours, and every time they mentioned a kid's name, they had to bleep it out. But once I got them, it was unbelievable. Like, I could see that, like, there was an officer who was completely not okay with it. The principal of the school was horrified. She thought she was gonna be arrested. I mean, it was just, there was action, there were stakes, there were people that were questioning the system that were not listened to, there were people that were blindly following orders. It was wild to hear it all in their own voices. So, like, the power of audio and the power of just asking for not just that report, but what's underneath that report. What is that report based on? Okay, then I start filing public records requests. And I use a spreadsheet because it's fun. And then I get to say how many I did. So I just start asking for everything I can find. And you don't have to, like, read all these. I just wanted to show you that, like, kind of I create a public records spreadsheet. And in it is things like my request, complete evidence from the Hobgood internal investigation file. My request was, like, more detailed than that, but for my own notes, like, this is what I'm doing. And then I'm getting, how many people try to get personnel files? Personnel file, okay, they are amazing. Every single city, county, public sector employee has a personnel file. And you can get that personnel file, and inside that personnel file are personal action forms, so, like, things that they've done wrong and got disciplined for. They can be, like, the training that they've had. Listen, I got the judges for every single job she ever had. I couldn't get, like, she didn't have one as a judge, but she had been a public sector employee in other capacities. I got every single one of those. I mean, some of them had her application from, like, after she got out of college, it had her grade point average. It also tells you, like, how backwards we were back in the day, because, like, when she applied for jobs, she had to list her marital status and her weight, which was like, what the? Anyway, but personnel files can be really, really valuable because you can see inside of them, like, things that people have done and gotten reprimanded for, letters that have been written about them, just everything that you can get their own resumes, like their references. The references were great, called those people. So anyway, I'm just trying to find everything I can. So I'm creating a public records spreadsheet, I'm filing public records, I'm keeping track of whether they're fulfilled, whether they're not, when I followed up, when I need to follow up. And then, these are the then, so I've got my breadcrumbs, I've got all my filings, I've got, like, depositions, peeks inside this system, more than peeks. I mean, the door is kind of slightly ajar here. And then I've got to figure out, like, okay, what is my story? Like, who is going to drive this? What are the characters going to be? There's the judge. There's the two lawyers who, as I learned, are very interesting, former juvenile delinquents themselves, struggled for many years with substance abuse disorder, also recovering alcoholic. They ended up taking cases in juvenile court because they couldn't get a job anywhere else, because they had DUIs on their records. They had drug possession on their records. And I'll get to Wes in a second, but like I found them to be really interesting because I noticed, I was like, why are all their names like on all these lawsuits? What's the deal with these lawyers? So they quickly emerge as characters. And then you've got the kids. These are just a smattering of the kids, but the kids are so important, and we'll hear from the kids in a bit. But I zeroed in on Wes, which is this guy, because he got to the court right after he graduated from law school. And he, like I said, couldn't get another job. And he walked in, and he immediately saw something. From his very first case, which I want to play this clip, but just to tee it up, he gets his first case. He's like this young, he's like 25. He's like, I'm finally going to be a lawyer. And he gets a girl, a 12-year-old girl, who's been arrested for reckless burning. She accidentally started a fire in a neighbor's barn. No one was hurt, but she's arrested. She's sent to jail. She stays there overnight. He gets her case, and he goes to see her in jail the next day. This is his very first case. Can you play that?
I remember just like physically how small she was, like kind of struck me like, wow, this is a really little kid, you know?
The girl was 12, wearing the jail's standard issue jumpsuit. Wes was thrown.
I remember feeling like I am in a penal facility. I visited prisons before. I'd been in jails before myself, and it was very much identical to an adult prison. And I'm sitting across from this little scared 12-year-old girl who had like accidentally started a fire and had now spent the night in jail. It just felt wrong, you know? It did not feel like this is how kids should be treated. It didn't feel like this was the right place for this 12-year-old to be.
So I really was struck by Wes because he got into this system more than a decade after it had really gotten humming with these policies. And there's all these lawyers in it. This is a system full of lawyers, and he walks in and he notices something. And I'm like, why does he notice something and nobody else does? Why is he gonna try to do something and no one else has? So I began to really lock into like, what was his journey? Why is he asking questions? Why is he gonna literally bite the hand that feeds him? Because remember, as an appointed lawyer, you're getting cases from the judge, from the judge's clerk. So piss off the judge, you might not get another case. But he had this kind of, because of his own experiences, like he had this kind of just chip on his shoulder. He had this like bulldog mentality. He just like hated the system. And I was immediately struck by that. And I thought, this guy is really interesting. And I want to know, like, why did he ask questions and why did he and nobody else, you know, do that? So anyway, these are my characters. So now I'm thinking, I've got the story, I've got the documents, but I have to make it a story of characters. But
I remember just...
But what do you do when the people in your story won't talk to you? Like the judge. The judge is just, no, she wasn't going to talk to me. The jailer wasn't going to talk to me. And so I will admit I got very lucky in this instance. But of course you start trying to figure out, like, what else have they said? Where else are they talking? And it turned out that the judge had a radio show for 10 years on the local radio station.
Well, good morning to you. Welcome into the Action Line from WGNS. This morning we're talking about the Rutherford County Juvenile Court System. And Judge Donna Scott Davenport is our guest this morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Bart.
Good to have you with us today.
Thank you. Always love
Judge
that.
Davenport wouldn't talk to me, so I wasn't able to ask her directly any of my questions, which were all variations of the same question. Why? Why order law enforcement to arrest children when they shouldn't? Why allow jail staff to lock them up when they shouldn't? But there was a place where for 10 years, Judge Davenport shared many of her views on all things juvenile court. WGNS Radio, Rutherford County's Good Neighbor station. On the first Tuesday of every month, she could be heard chatting with host Bart Walker III.
And it's a sunny day out today.
It is, even though if we got a little snow coming in, that's okay. We're always open for business down on South
Absolutely.
Church Street.
Well, of course.
So it goes on. She had 70 hours, and I listened to all 70 hours, and it nearly liquefied my brain. And I transcribed it all in Trent so I could go back and see kind of how did she talk, what were the stories she told over and over again. And the way that she talked about her work, you realized this was her propaganda machine. This is where she got to say what she did and all the good things that she did. And nobody asked her any hard questions. Bart Walker III was not asking her hard questions. But wow, what an amazing resource for me, because she doesn't want to talk to me, but I can say I listened to 70 hours of it, and I think I know a little bit about Judge Davenport and her worldview, which was very boomer. No offense to boomers, my parents are boomers. But anyway, so what do you do? And I will say the other thing that I did with the jailer, I found out that the jailer went before this small county commission, the Public Safety Commission, every single month. She's been the jailer for 22 years. I went back as far as I could on the YouTube channel, and I watched 12 years worth of meetings, which was almost 140 meetings, where I could see how she presented her materials, her numbers, the questions she was asked by commissioners, which gave me a really good sense for how she talked about her work. So talking about kind of doing the right around, like you're just looking for anything that you can. Now, not everybody will find a radio show. This was really, really delightful. But there are ways that you can get into the story. Okay, so this is kind of like, here was what I've amassed. 7 lawsuits. I start reaching out, finding young people. Let me tell you, it's not hard to find the people who are affected by this system in a relatively, I mean, it's a big county for Tennessee, but like, it's not huge, and this was a rite of passage for kids, right? So you talk to one kid, and they're like, oh, I had 3 friends that were arrested. Like, I know, and you just start making the connections. I started to reach out to employees, county officials, childhood friends of the judge. I had the radio show, I had the community meetings, I had the court filings, depositions, jail and court documents, internal memos, personnel action, the personnel files. I ended up filing more than 60 FOIA requests. That got me state, county data and documents, personnel files, disciplinary records, all that stuff. So like this is like all the things inside of it. And then I'm funneling that into the characters. I'm funneling that into a story. This is my story. Okay, so this is a very rudimentary thing that I try to draw, but you can just see kind of the structure of the story was essentially, right, I start with the Hobgood arrests, and then Wes arrives at the court. He finds Mark, who finally kind of starts to listen to him. Mark has been asleep at the wheel for a while as a lawyer in the court. He suddenly gets all revved up by this young guy who comes in and is like, no, we got to sue this place. And he's like, yeah, maybe we should sue this place. And they decide to sue, first over solitary confinement, which was really close to Wes. Wes himself had been in solitary confinement as a kid. And they realized that they actually get solitary confinement stopped in the entire state with this. This was one of the lawsuits I found. But essentially what I do is I follow, like from that kind of flashpoint, right? I go back in time, I come up, I meet that again, and then I track the lawsuit and the class action, how they get settled. And then it goes from a reconstructed story to a reporter's journey story, right? Which means that it goes from me trying to reconstruct all this time where I wasn't there, which is very hard for me because I like being in the action, to me driving the story. So the first 3 episodes are this reconstruction, and the 4th episode pivots to me saying, okay, the lawsuit is settled. How many kids actually got justice? What does this mean? What changes have come for the county? I will say that in my reporting, after I published my first initial investigation, the judge announced that she would be retiring. She was going to run for re-election again last summer. She was going to run for re-election. She decides she will not run for re-election. Like a bunch of members of Congress write a letter to the Attorney General Merrick Garland saying that Rutherford County needs to be investigated. Democrats in the state legislature file a resolution to oust the judge. Like, a lot of stuff happened. It was great. The governor of Tennessee is like, we need to look into this. Great. But the thing is that when you're an investigative reporter and you stop there, it's not the full story. Because the reality is that's a lot of reaction and it's a lot of noise, but it doesn't necessarily mean that like change is actually coming. So I ended up following the story and trying to ask my own questions about what was changing in the county. And this is just a little excerpt of an interview that I have with a county commissioner who watched the jailer and the judge come before them every month for budgets to present their numbers. And my question to the county is like, what reckoning is happening? Do you realize what you've done? You just had to pay out millions of dollars in federal lawsuits. And yet, like, this jailer is still here. The judge is gone off with her pension. Like, what does the county feel? And so this was.
In my conversation with Commissioner Jeff Phillips, when I pressed him on who was responsible for what happened, did he think it was Davenport? Duke? He was resolute.
You get this really clear. I am not going to mention names, and I'm not going to point fingers at anybody else. I'm just not going to do that.
Why is it important for you to not do that?
Because I think there are some dedicated public servants out there whose lives have the potential to be ruined because of something that might be said from a negative perspective about them and how they've conducted their professional life. And I just don't think that that's fair.
What strikes me about Jeff's response is how he and other officials are so willing to extend grace to Duke and Davenport, two people who so often refuse to extend that same grace to the children who came before them.
So that's, me trying to understand, like, what is happening in this county, and really going toe-to-toe with public officials over it. Okay, so I know you haven't heard from the kids, which I kind of did purposefully, and I just want to say, like, I want to end it with the kids, but essentially what we decided to do in terms of the storytelling was we decided to consolidate nearly all of the voices of young people in the third episode. And that was a very conscious decision. Like, we have one child in the first episode. You hear about a kid in the second episode that's getting solitary. But instead of spreading it out over all of the episodes, I really wanted to have a moment where you sat with these voices for a very long time, and that together, like, they created a really just a moving portrait of what they'd experienced, and that you just had to sit with them. Just sit with them, because this is the thing, nobody had sat with these kids. Nobody had listened to these kids. And so what it ended up being was this kind of what we call a vox weave of 15 minutes of young people's voices, of what they went through from getting arrested to going to the jail, to the intake process, to being held, to going before the judge. And this is just like a short excerpt of kind of how we did that.
I was 16, yeah.
Was when I was 14 years old.
15 years old.
Ninth grade.
I was like 11 or 12.
Like, I was 12 years old the first time I got arrested.
How old were you?
7.
Oh my God.
I talked to 25 people, now adults, who told me about being arrested or locked up as kids in Rutherford County.
I had gotten into a fight at school.
We went in a store and decided we were going to steal sunglasses and magazines.
I just ran away. I ran away.
I spray painted a penis on a wall.
A kid named Zeb was in 9th grade when he got charged with petty theft for taking a portable speaker from his grandma.
I remember sitting on my bed and I hear a knock at the door, and I kind of go towards the door, and then all of a sudden they come in and they said, "Mr. Smotherman, you're under arrest for like theft, and put your hands behind your back." And I asked him, I said, "Man, how long am I going to be arrested for this?" He said, "For a year, for all I care."
Anyway, that's just a little bit. So there's 15 minutes where we just hear all the kids talking about the moment they get arrested, the intake process where they have to get naked and take a cold shower in front of a guard. They're given a jumpsuit. One kid talks about how it's like he's so young that the jumpsuit should go to his elbows, but it goes to his wrists. About being put in solitary. having everything stripped out of your cell except for a Bible and a cup. And you just sit with these kids, which I think is so important because the work that we do is essentially to get inside of these systems so that we can listen to kids. And I think, just to kind of close out before questions, like I really, like I feel very strongly that like this is a story about a system and all the individuals that were in that system, the individuals that tried to fight that system, and then the individuals that were complicit in that system. And that could essentially describe every system, and I wanted to be able to not just humanize the kids, but to humanize the people who were fighting for the kids, the lawyers. And then to understand that while like systems have innate, ways that they are oppressing people, that systems are made up of people, right? And so if we can't kind of reconcile that like systems are systems, but systems are also people, and who are the people that are in that system, and what's the power that they have and that they're allowed to have, and why do they have that power, and is that power ever been questioned? I think, that is kind of like what I was hoping to get across with this story, is that it would be a story about a system, but a story about people, and the people that were complicit in that, and the people that weren't, and why. So anyway, that's my presentation.
I think you did a masterful job in really amplifying the role that the system plays in absolutely shutting down the path toward solutions. It's just, this is the way we do it. It's the way we always do it. One size fits all.
Yep.
That's
Statistics
wrong.
be damned.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any questions or comments?
Jenny Monk, Connecticut Mirror. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the decision to include as part of this story the discussion of the attorneys' addictions and their divorces.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, like as a reporter, like I really lean into complexities about human beings. And the thing is that I wanted to show the limitations of not just the system that the kids were in, but the system that the lawyers were in to fight against those systems. And so following the lawsuits felt really important to me, but also to understand like why these lawyers were so uniquely qualified. Part of my love of this story was that this wasn't some like pro bono national firm that came in. This wasn't like a civil rights corps or anything that came in. These were lawyers that cut their teeth in this courtroom, going up against this judge. I mean, there's a part in the second episode where Wes is saying like, you are not following the detention statute, and he prints it out and he like keeps waving it in front of the judge, and the judge is like, and it's like, what is happening? This is not reality. And so there was a theme in this of like the realities, and the reality within the court and the reality outside of the court. And the reality outside of the court was that, this guy saw something that other people didn't, and he was willing to talk about it. And part of the reason why he saw that was because he was one of those kids, right? And and also that even though he's like a crusader for these kids, he relapses in the middle of the case. So does Mark. Mark relapses on alcohol. Like, I wanted to show that like what they went through for these kids, like this was arduous. This was extremely difficult. They were 3 solo attorneys pouring every penny they had into this case. And that was stressful. And to act like their own problems or their own like life complexities had suddenly just fallen away, that they weren't part of this, that would have not been true. So I felt like it was really important to humanize them in that way, and to really be able to reconcile that like people are complicated and they can do amazing things and have their own personal struggles that they're still dealing with. And it just felt like it was a way to really get at the soul of who they were and who they are as human beings.
I'm Marissa from Good Housekeeping. It was so fascinating to see all the work that went into this, but I wanted to ask about something that you mentioned earlier about finding those like partnerships that would support that long-form journalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's been, I think, a really wonderful like trend that I've seen lately. So this story initially started with a partnership with ProPublica, where I was in their local reporting network. And then I did a story in 2021, and that's in this like kind of, because I've never done a story before a podcast, which I don't know if I'd recommend, but anyway, we dealt with it. A lot of people did not want to talk to me afterwards. So But essentially, like, I had done this for ProPublica, and then I got another year with ProPublica, and I decided that I was going to do a podcast. And then, interestingly enough, like, Serial had started up. They'd not started up, but they'd been acquired by the New York Times. And so Serial came asking, like, oh, hey, like, we're interested. Do you want to partner with us? And I was like, well, I'm already partnered with ProPublica. But it was really cool because it became this, like, 3-partner thing. So it was ProPublica, the New York Times and Serial, and Nashville Public Radio, this local, and as hard as it is to keep the communication flowing, to keep everything, everybody informed, to decide who has tiebreaker, it was unbelievably formative for me and so helpful. I mean, I got to see how they make this stuff at a very high level. I got to see, like, all the music is composed for the show. Like, I would never be able to do that or have the resources. I got close with the composers. The composers were local too. Like, it was just a wonderful way to amplify the work, but also pay attention to local. Pay attention to the local industry of me and the musicians and the kids and the system. And so I have noticed that more and more places are interested in doing partnerships. My next project, which is on the state legislature, is with NPR, with the embedded team there. And I think, what I've noticed is that after, like, Trump was elected, after national outlets realized that they weren't getting it right sometimes, that they have humbled themselves and really looked to strong local outlets and local reporters to say, hey, can we work with you? Because, like, your boot's on the ground. And so there's a lot of opportunities out there, and you can make your own opportunities too. I mean, Serial had never partnered with a local outlet. They'd never partnered with a local reporter, but we did it, just took some negotiating.
I believe, Alyssa, you're doing a podcast, is that correct? Did I hear you say you were doing a podcast?
Oh, I do a long-running, like, chat show.
A chat show.
Okay.
Not narrative, though, so.
Anyone else in the room doing one or thinking about it? No. Oh, okay. No, I mean,
Come talk to me.
The reason I say that is because it's something that I've thought about through the years, but I think what it also points to is, I started out in this business in 1986, and when I sat in newsrooms, I said, the whole community, Black community in Clearwater is invisible. I want to step into the breach. I want to do stories about it. And I initially was told nobody cares or they don't read us, so we don't care. So I think here we are 40 years later with this acknowledgement and this recognition that there are voices that need to be in the mix. And so I think all of you should, as you consider that you're going to have to be thought of as multimedia journalists more and more, this is a really, really great information to have. Stephen. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and then Stephen. Okay.
Hi there, Michelle San Miguel with Rhode Island PBS. First of all, congratulations. This is incredible work, and I think it's a dream for many journalists that they aspire to. I found it very helpful when you broke down, like, the story structure, and I'm curious, can you speak more to the process? How long were you working on this? Were you exclusively working on this? And if you were working on other projects, how did you manage your time? Were you, like, the first 4 hours of the day working on this? Because, it's hard to convince bosses to only work on something like this long form.
I know. And I feel like, so this might not be the best example of that because I did get to work on it full time, but when I first started in 2018 with my first season of The Promise, I was just a beat reporter. And so what I've learned to do is really look at the production schedule and say, okay, when I'm in the reporting mode of something, I can peel off little dailies, a cut copy, little things for, the newscast. But all of it is going towards something bigger. So finding the opportunities to peel off little stories, so you're not, like, actually, like, jumping around, but you're, like, building towards something bigger, that can be really helpful and keep your editors happy. And then what I would do is I'd negotiate, like, okay, for, like, the first 3 months, like, I will be doing, like, 1 or 2 stories a week. And then we go into a different phase of production, which is, like, the writing, which is pretty intense, right? So can I take it down to 1 story a week in the writing? Then you get to, like, the really intense post-production where you're working on all the episodes at once, where you're trying to track, fact check, all that stuff. Then I was like, I can't do anything. So if you can get to a point with your editors where you can say, okay, can we, like, ramp it up where I'm not completely unavailable for 9 months or 6 months, but, like, for 2 months I'm unavailable. Like, can we carve that out? And I like ramp up to that. So that's one way of doing it. This was incredibly labor intensive. Serial is no joke. I mean, every episode had 30 to 40 versions. They don't mess around. And not just like 30, I mean, we would reiterate an episode maybe 4 or 5 times, like completely wholesale, like it's not working or this. And then you'd get to kind of like the more incremental edits, and every time, you resave as a new draft. So I don't want to say, it's not like 34 wholesale rewrites, but there is a lot of wholesale rewrites. And it's just very consuming. Like, they're just very intense. But we did spend a lot of time at the beginning structuring. We did probably 8 or 9 iterations of the outline for the whole show. And then those end up getting thrown out when you start writing the show. I'm kind of like, why did we do that? But anyway. But yeah, so we spent all this time creating a outline, that gets kind of more and more detailed, like as we revise it. And then when you start launching into each episode, you're kind of taking that outline, you're seeing it on the page, seeing what works, seeing what's not working. And Serial says, and I think this is pretty much the case, like every episode that they do usually takes about a month. I can say sometimes it takes a little bit longer, just because there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. But it's a very intense process. But not everybody has to do it like that. Like I think there was a lot of fat in their process personally. Like, coming from a radio station that was like really bare bones, like we would have a limit of like 3 edits, and we'd get groups together, people, so it was like sweat lodge edits, so you can have lots of eyes and ears on it, but it's not like this never-ending process of editing. So you can create some parameters and boundaries that can both get you all the feedback you need, but have kind of a ascending order of like, okay, and now we're done, we're moving on.
Let's take the last question from Stephen.
Yeah.
A lot of this you've already just answered, but it's on this idea that it seems like there is a growing withdrawal of podcasting when in the public radio space, from on the national side to on the local stations. I've heard from local general managers saying like either narrative podcasts are always in the red. They don't work out for us in the long run. So what's your thoughts on that for the future of these types of projects?
That's the $1 million question. It has been an incredibly difficult year for podcasts. It's very scary to see amazing work like Stolen, that won the Pulitzer and a Peabody, everybody get laid off by Spotify. It's Heavyweight, one of the best podcasts of all time by Jonathan Goldstein, gone. It's really scary to see podcasting kind of atrophy, specifically audio journalism. I feel like we're going to have another year of hard times, but I think essentially like the ad model is broken, because what you're doing is you're selling impressions. So it's like, if you get, basically the going rate is like for every 1,000 listens, it's $25 to $30. For a Joe Rogan, that's gonna make good money. For a narrative podcast on the juvenile justice system, that's gonna be hard to recoup. I mean, even with Serial, you get a huge listenership, but like, these things take time and money to make. And so I think what's interesting, and I'm really interested to see kind of what happens with this, but I don't know if anybody has read about like kind of how Ava DuVernay financed her latest film, Origin, where she went to the Ford Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates. And I've heard from some folks in the audio world that that's something that's increasingly of interest. Like the Obamas have a foundation now, they're interested in getting into this stuff. I think that more and more that foundations will become part of the economic engine that drives these and the funding model for them. But we just can't expect the downloads that Joe Rogan gets. Like, this is absurd. Like, he sits with a mic and says crazy stuff for 4 hours. Like, I made less than 4 hours and it took me 3 years. Like, it's just, there's no way to equate it. But to the ad execs, you sell it the same exact way. So something's got to change in the model, and whether that's like a kind of subscription-based thing like Audible has or like Luminary did, maybe that's on the future of it. I I cringe a little at that because I don't want my stuff behind a paywall, especially when it's about communities that have been pushed aside and marginalized and not listened to. Like, I don't want them to have an obstacle to listen to it. However, I think there's a solution to that maybe with handing out a lot of free subscriptions or whatever. But I don't know what the answer is. But I know that the bottom line is that people are still listening to this stuff. I don't know if people saw, but today the New Yorker dropped a new audio narrative podcast they acquired In the Dark after APM Reports laid off everybody. In the Dark is like it won 2 Peabodys, it got a guy off death row, and still American Public Media did not know how to sell ads for it, which is boggling to me. It's been downloaded something like 40 million times. But the New Yorker was like, we think we can do something with this. So I think there's a lot of shifting. I think the bottom line is that people listen to this stuff. It's very intriguing to them. It's like going to Netflix and watching a 3-part true crime series. But the story is important. The listenership is a demographic that folks are interested in. I mean, I remember hearing the head of NPR talk and saying, like, our average demo for our terrestrial radio is like 55 and like white, and our demo for our podcast is like 32 and like very diverse. At the end of the day, like, that is the audience that people want and need to sustain this, and so those people are listening. It's just the bean counters and the ad execs have to figure out how do you fund a thing that is, while they're all filed under podcasts, the products are so vastly different. So I think that audio journalism is struggling right now, but I know that there's more talented people than ever, and I think that it's a medium that people want to hear and listen to, and we've got to figure out how to actually fund it in a way that's sustainable. But people are listening, like, they love these shows. They're so engaged with these shows. Like, when In the Dark they laid off, like, there was like almost like a mutiny. They were like, what are you doing? Like, this is the best show ever. So the audiences are very loyal in the same way that like NPR audiences are very loyal. You have a connection with the host, like you hear their voice. And so I think it's just gonna take some imagination. It's gonna take some things like falling out. There was like a bubble that just burst. And so I think it's just gonna take some shifting.
Well, you wrapped things up beautifully when you said people are listening. Mm-hmm. And they're listening and they want to hear different voices and they want to hear different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's been such a privilege to hear from you today. And so let's take this opportunity to thank Meribah Knight for her presentation.
And 2 podcasts I would just recommend centering voices. My friend Allison Flowers did a podcast called Somebody, and then there's another podcast called You Didn't See Nothing, both of which take place in Chicago. Also, Buffalo Extreme, which takes place in Buffalo, around where the shooting happened. And they're all experimenting with the hosts being people in the stories. So handing that over to the mother who's trying to solve her son's murder, handing it over to the man who lived in the neighborhood, who started to like ask questions about this murder, basically saying, like, as hosts, as like, say, like a white reporter coming into a community of color and saying, like, I want to tell a story. There's all these experiments happening where it's like, how can we hand the mic over to somebody with that lived experience in an ethical way, pay them a living wage, get them, like, not say, you are a journalist, but you're also you, and that brings something. So there is some really exciting stuff happening with people with the lived experience taking control of the narrative, and it's really exciting. So those are just 3 kind of podcasts that.
My instincts told me you would really ignite creativity in this conversation, and you really have. So thank you so much. And we're so pleased you can stick around for a while, have lunch with us. What I wanted to say is that we've got our folks from Home for Me are outside along with Reggie Singleton, who will be taking us on the tour. So what I'd love us to do, if we could just quickly go grab our lunch, come back in, and then in about 20 minutes or so, we'll start that informal conversation with our guests. But I hope you've enjoyed this morning as much as I have. It's been incredible. So thank you.